There is significant debate over whether or not there has been a genocide against Native American people. Many say that Christopher Columbus and the first European colonizers in the late 15th century committed genocide by wiping out the Native Americans with diseases and slavery. However, this was largely an unintended consequence of colonization. There was another period of time where white Americans purposely attempted to rid North America of Native Americans entirely, Manifest Destiny during the early and mid-19th century. Not every historian agrees whether this constitutes a genocide, but there is plenty of primary and secondary evidence to support the argument of genocide. There is one main reason that credible historians argue over whether there is a genocide against Native Americans. Not everyone agrees on the exact definition of genocide. The technical definition comes from the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1951, right after the end of World War II and the Holocaust. According to the United Nations General Assembly, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This legal definition was adopted right as the field of genocide studies was born. Phrases such as deliberately inflicting and serious bodily harm are subjective, and the contemporary definition has since grown to include other types of genocide, such as politicide, or the elimination of a cultural identity without necessarily eliminating people themselves. The main point of contention regarding the definition of genocide and Native American genocide in particular is intent, or, from the UN's definition, an intent to destroy. Before analyzing intent, we must look at what or whom was being destroyed during the period known as Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny was a time period from about the end of the War of 1812 to the Civil War, but it was more than just an era. It was an ideology that fueled American politics and policy during the 19th century. Manifest Destiny refers to a specific type of American expansionism, positing that the United States was destined by fate or by God to spread across the continent, from sea to shining sea and beyond. One of its hallmarks was the notion that white settlers had a duty to spread progress and wealth across their inherited land at the expense of barbaric or savage Native Americans. This idea was eventually realized into the infamous poem and comic of White Man's Burden. Although White Man's Burden was not created until 1899, its support of American colonialism and a white savior complex existed long before that time. Manifest Destiny engendered an idealized view of American expansionism at the time. To American expansionists, qualified people, even the oppressed, could be admitted to the Union after an arduous indoctrination process. Many white Americans labored under the illusion that those who were brought into the Union under Manifest Destiny would benefit from it despite the loss involved with relocation and removal. Despite this misguided altruism, Americans mainly believed that they had the God-given right to expand west and inherit their land from unworthy Native Americans and Mexicans. While the Mexican-American War was the focus of that time period, and it is true that the United States forcibly took hundreds of thousands of square miles of land from Mexico, there is an important distinction between American treatment of Mexicans and Native Americans at that time. According to late historian Frederick Merck, while Mexicans were seen as able to be brought peacefully into the United States and society, Native Americans had no place in American society, and the government either wanted to cast them out or preferred to ignore their existence. Native Americans were deemed savages for a variety of reasons, one of the most important being that, unlike Mexicans, Native Americans were not Christian. Due to the purported Native American savagery, their land was to be transferred to the more capable hands of white people of the United States. As egregious as these acts were, stealing land does not in and of itself constitute a genocide. There is a great loss of life and identity in the Native American community since European contact in 1492. Before this, historians estimate that there were over 5 million Native Americans inhabiting the modern continental United States. By the 1800s, nearly 4.5 million of that number were dead, leaving 600,000 Native Americans. Much of this can be contributed to diseases, slavery, and outright murder. By the end of the 19th century, after the period of Manifest Destiny, Native American population reached an all-time low of 250,000 people. The majority of Native American death, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, was due to uncontrollable European diseases that natives were unaccustomed to. However, there is a crucial difference between the diseases which accidentally wiped out the majority of the Native American population in the early 1500s versus the purposeful starvation, deportation, and violence against them in the 17 and 1800s. One Native American leader who articulated both grievances and commendations against white colonizers was Sauk Chief Makatai Meashe Kiakiak, known in English as Chief Black Hawk. He witnessed the death of many of his people at the hands of white men, including a close friend's son who he considered to be his own family. Black Hawk often wished to avenge his death and the murder of the Sauk people, and, most of all, wished to reclaim land that was taken from him and his tribe. He started the Black Hawk War of 1832, in which his tribe returned to its native lands of Illinois after being driven out by the American government. He was not successful and suffered imprisonment and other mishaps. Regarding the loss of his land and his dealings with white men, Black Hawk writes in his autobiography,
"Bad and cruel as our people were treated by the whites, not one of them was hurt or molested by our band. I hope this will prove that we are a peaceable people. Having permitted 10 men to take possession of our cornfields, prevent us from planting corn, burn our lodges, ill-treat our women, and beat to death our men without offering resistance to their barbarous cruelties."
Later in his life, Black Hawk came to respect the United States to a degree and traveled the span of the country in awe. However, he and his Sauk tribe, or what was left of it, never forgot how they had been misplaced and mistreated by white Americans. This was true for Native American people all around North America who were affected by American expansionism. Where white Americans did not forcibly remove or kill Native Americans, they often pursued a course of forced assimilation or suppression of power. During the course of Manifest Destiny and after the Civil War, Native American children were often sent to schools where they participated in a vicious process of assimilation into white society.
In most American schools, Hayes is not really dealt with at all. People don't know him really for anything. But if you actually look at Native American studies, he's actually a fairly infamous president in that he is part of he's really seen as the beginning of this boarding school movement, which kind of had predated him, but definitely takes off under his administration in the 1870s. And in that program, what happened is that indigenous people were removed, often forcibly, from their parents and from their homes, placed in schools, and were forced to assimilate into Western white culture. And so everything from cutting of hair to the attempts to eradicate indigenous languages, indigenous religious customs, it's pretty gruesome. And the U.S. is not alone in this. Australia and Canada also did a similar policy. And so this was all done very explicitly. This was not a byproduct. Like, this wasn't like the U.S. was attempting to build a school system for Native American children, and what came out of it was this kind of violent cultural assimilation. The schools were actually designed specifically for cultural assimilation, with the idea that you would actually eradicate Native American identities.
Forced assimilation of children is not uncommon in situations of genocide. During the Armenian Genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century, the Turkish attempted to destroy Armenian identity in children at its most fundamental level through schooling. In Armenian genocide survivor Karnik Panian's autobiography, Goodbye Antura, he details how young Armenian children, including himself, were placed in violent schools where they were punished for speaking Armenian instead of Turkish, could not practice Christianity, and witnessed or received brutal punishments akin to torture for not complying with Turkish standards and identity. While Native Americans were not often punished as brutally, they received the same pressure to abandon their culture for the supposedly superior white identity. In the process of taking Native American land, the United States government also worked to limit the amount of power and influence Native Americans had even in their own reservations. In his speech, Our Treatment of the Cherokees, American statesman and great compromiser Henry Clay detailed his and much of the American government's view of the Native American situation. Aside from excusing American treatment of Native Americans by claiming that plentiful provisions and land were given to the Cherokees despite the fact that they were misplaced and sometimes killed, Clay also inadvertently outlines a few hypocritical concepts in the treatment of the Cherokees and other Native Americans. He emphasizes that Native Americans had no sovereign power as a nation and fell under the rule and law of the United States, yet the government still claimed that the Native Americans could rule their reservations as they liked, with minimal interference from the government. This was blatantly false. Native Americans were essentially forced to trust the United States government's promises of protection without any legal means of enforcing this mutual trust or protecting themselves. Additionally, while the Native Americans lived under the jurisdiction of the United States, they were kept completely separate from the rest of American society. Clay mentions that white people would be punished for approaching these reservations uninvited. So, Native Americans were given fewer rights than traditional American citizens and pushed to the fringes of society while being expected to build a new life in a foreign land and blindly trust that the government had their best interest in mind. It is clear that the United States took almost everything from Native Americans: land, identity, political power, and life. The question then becomes, did the American people do this specifically to wipe out Native Americans? Or was it simply for their own profit, and Native Americans were just in the way?
Even though the U.S. government is going for domination of the lands and territories, the U.S. government at different key points, and U.S. society in general, this isn't just the state, this is also American cultural writ large, could have taken a policy of integration, could have taken a policy of racial inclusion and diversity. And so we see this with the different nations that attempt to enter the United States, that take their case, and the Cherokee being the big one. They're the kind of leaders of this. They go all the way to the Supreme Court. The court actually more or less sides with them, and then Jackson says no. The Jackson administration says no, actually you can't be integrated into the United States. So even though it's we only want land, they only want land for white people, and so it is actually ethnic cleansing at that point.
The United States government, which served the intentions and ambitions of the general populace, purposefully acted to remove Native Americans from society and the world in the face of other options, such as inclusion. Some who argue against the idea of Native American genocide, such as historian Gunter Louis, say that because there was never any specific order to kill all Native Americans, it was not a genocide. However, governments do not always specifically announce their intentions when enacting policy. Louis also argues that while certain individuals in the United States were for the extermination of Native Americans, no government official held that position. There were, in fact, several individuals who enacted policies in the government that supported the extermination of Native American identity and life. Rutherford B. Hayes and Henry Clay have already received mention, but the most infamous anti-Native American leader in the history of the United States was Andrew Jackson, who ordered the Trail of Tears, which led to the death of thousands of Native Americans in a short period of time. He also ascribed to the notion that Native Americans were less than white Americans, and promoted a sense of white nationalism in the United States that lingers in American life to this day. During the period of Manifest Destiny, there were massacres and elimination of identity of Native Americans, and, whether it was explicitly stated or not, there was an intent to do so. For all intents and purposes, this fits the definition of genocide. Native Americans still suffer from the effects of Manifest Destiny to this day, yet they often receive less attention and aid than other people of color in the nation. One of the first steps that American society needs to make on behalf of Native Americans is to admit that there was a time when white society wanted to eliminate Native Americans, and whites still benefit from this process and its effects to this day.